You already know more about the people around you than you realize. The information has always been there. In the pause before someone answers a difficult question. In the specific things that make someone uncomfortable. In the behaviors that repeat regardless of context, regardless of stated intention, regardless of how much time passes. The problem is not that people are impossible to understand. The problem is that you were never taught the language they are actually speaking. Friedrich Nietzsche was not a psychologist in the clinical sense. He was something more dangerous, a philosopher who refused to accept comfortable explanations for human behavior. He watched people with a kind of unflinching attention that most of us avoid because what it reveals is too uncomfortable to sit with for long. And what he saw, actors across decades of observation and thought, was this. Human beings are almost never doing what they appear to be doing. Not because they are liars, but because they are survivors. And survival, over a long enough timeline, produces layers of behavior so automatic, so deeply embedded, that the person performing them has no conscious awareness of the performance. What follows is an exploration of 18 truths drawn from Nietzsche's understanding of human psychology. Not as a list to be skimmed, but as a sequence to be absorbed, because each truth builds on the one before it, and by the time you reach the 18th, you will not merely understand other people differently. You will understand yourself in ways that may be, initially, deeply uncomfortable, and ultimately, irreversibly clarifying. The first truth is the foundation everything else rests on. Every person you meet is wearing a mask, not in the theatrical sense, and not as a moral failure, as a survival mechanism. From the earliest moments of social existence, human beings learn which versions of themselves are safe to show, and which are not. The child who discovered that vulnerability led to ridicule learns to present toughness. The one who found that need was punished learns to perform independence. The one who discovered that genuine emotion was inconvenient learns to substitute pleasant blankness. These early negotiations between the self and the environment produce a persona, a constructed presentation designed to minimize rejection and maximize acceptance. Nietzsche called this the mask, and he understood it not as deception, but as adaptation. The crucial insight here is that the mask is not the lie, and the face beneath it is not the truth in any simple sense. Most people have worn their masks so long that they have partially forgotten there was ever anything underneath. The first skill of genuine psychological reading is learning to notice where the mask sits slightly wrong, where the performance requires a little too much effort, where the reaction is slightly misaligned with the situation, where something doesn't quite add up. Those misalignments are not noise. They are signal. They are where the actual person begins to be visible. The second truth follows directly from the first. What someone hates most intensely in others is almost always something they have refused to acknowledge in themselves. Nietzsche observed this phenomenon with particular precision. The person who cannot stop pointing out the arrogance in others is often the person who secretly fears their own grandiosity and is working overtime to distance themselves from it. The one who is vigilant about dishonesty in the people around them is frequently the one who has been maintaining a carefully constructed lie about something in their own life. We do not hate neutrally in others what we simply dislike. We hate most passionately what we most fear finding in ourselves. This truth changes the way you use criticism as information. When someone tells you what they despise, they are not just describing the external world. They are providing you with a partial map of their interior one. Listen to the content of the contempt. Note the emotional intensity. The greater the intensity, the more likely you are standing near something personally significant to the critic, rather than something genuinely significant about the target. The third truth concerns what happens when language stops. Silence reveals more than speech. Nietzsche was deeply skeptical of language as a vehicle for truth. He understood that words are social tools, shaped by what the speaker needs to communicate, by what will be received, by what feels safe to say. What a person chooses not to say, by contrast, is much less managed. The pause before an answer. The topic that gets redirected every time it approaches a certain depth. The short, closed responses to questions that warrant more. The way someone becomes suddenly very interested in something else when the conversation gets too close. These are not accidents. They are the shape of what cannot yet be said. Real listening includes listening to what is not there. And once you develop sensitivity to the negative space in conversation, to the absences, the redirections, the compressed answers, you begin to hear a second conversation running underneath the one being spoken. The fourth truth requires particular attention because it operates in a domain where most people are least suspicious. Excessive declarations of virtue are frequently disguise. Nietzsche was alert to what he identified as the will to power, operating through moral performance. The person who loudly and consistently positions themselves as the most ethical presence in the room, who corrects others' moral failures with relish, who performs goodness in ways that require an audience, is often using virtue as a form of elevation rather than genuine ethical commitment. Not always. But the specific quality to watch for is the need for the declaration to be public, the need for the virtue to be witnessed. Genuine ethical commitment is largely indifferent to whether it is seen. It operates in private with the same consistency it operates in public. The performance of virtue that requires an audience is the performance telling you something. The fifth truth is the one that most fundamentally changes how you experience being lied to. The first person anyone deceives is themselves. The lies you hear from people. I'm completely over it. I don't care what they think. I'm absolutely fine. Are rarely conscious manipulations designed to mislead you. They are usually the most current version of a story the person has been telling themselves for long enough that the story has settled into belief. Nietzsche understood self-deception not as weakness or malice, but as a functional adaptation, a way of maintaining the capacity to keep moving in situations where the full truth would be immobilizing. When someone's account of themselves contains internal inconsistencies, when their stated emotional state doesn't match their visible behavioral patterns, when their description of a situation keeps shifting in the retelling, this is usually not strategic deception directed at you. It is the seam showing in a self-constructed narrative. And seams are valuable information. They are the places where the actual experience is trying to push through the version that was deemed manageable. The sixth truth is perhaps Nietzsche's sharpest observation about the psychology of superiority. Where you encounter the most forceful display of superiority, look for the underlying inferiority that is driving it. The person who needs to remind you of their accomplishments has not yet found those accomplishments sufficient on their own terms. The person who diminishes others casually is not doing so from a secure position. They are doing it because the security they lack must be manufactured through comparison. Genuine self-possession has no need to compete. It does not require that others be smaller in order to feel adequate. When someone needs to dominate, to establish hierarchy, to make sure their status is registered, that compulsion is not evidence of strength. It is evidence of a self that has not found a stable foundation within itself and is building one externally through the management of how others perceive them. Now, a word about what these first 6 truths are asking of you before we go further. They are not asking you to become suspicious of everyone. They are not asking you to read malice into behavior that is simply human and frightened. They are asking you to develop a kind of double vision, the capacity to see what is being presented alongside a genuine curiosity about what is being protected. When you can hold both of those things at once, you become significantly less likely to be hurt by people's behavior, because you understand that their behavior is almost never actually about you. It is almost always about the self they are managing, the story they are maintaining, the fear they are keeping at bay. The seventh truth moves into the territory of motivation at the deepest level. Most behavior that appears to be pursuit is actually avoidance. People rarely do what they say they want. They do what they are afraid of losing. The person who overworks is rarely pursuing success in the pure sense. They are avoiding the feeling that emerges when they stop, and the silence becomes audible. The person who chases romantic attention is rarely pursuing connection. They are avoiding the specific quality of aloneness that feels unbearable to them. The person who argues compulsively is rarely pursuing truth. They are avoiding the experience of being wrong, which connects to something much older and more painful than the current disagreement. When you want to understand what actually drives someone, stop asking what they say they want. Ask what the behavior is protecting them from feeling. That question gets closer to the actual engine. And once you understand the engine, the surface behavior stops being baffling or frustrating and starts being legible. The eighth truth is the one about projection, extended. Repeated criticism reveals the critic's private war. When someone criticizes the same quality in person after person after person, when a specific category of failure in others seems to attract their attention reliably, you are watching the operation of what Nietzsche understood as disowned self-judgment. The thing that keeps drawing the eye, that keeps generating the response, is not random. It is connected to something internal that has not been integrated. The critic who focuses repeatedly on others' laziness is usually in some private relationship with their own. The one who cannot let go of others' dishonesty is usually managing an uncomfortable truth about themselves. Projection is not random. It has a target, and the target reveals the archer. The ninth truth concerns the specific tells embedded in performed confidence. Chronic certainty is frequently the sound of guilt or unresolved doubt. The person who is genuinely at peace with themselves is rarely at pains to perform that peace. They do not need to project it. They do not become defensive when it is questioned. They do not over-prepare in ways designed to eliminate every possible threat to their apparent composure. But the person who is managing guilt, who is carrying something they have not reconciled, often compensates through an exterior of exceptional certainty. The performance of certainty is sometimes a way of drowning out what is less certain inside. When someone seems too resolved, too fixed, too immovable, genuine curiosity rather than admiration is the appropriate response. Ask what the certainty is being used to protect. The 10th truth is one of the most practically useful. Exaggerated claims are a confession about where the doubt lives. When someone says absolutely never, when they say, I couldn't care less, when they say, I am always perfectly fine, the excess is telling. No one states the truth in extremes, because truth does not require extremes. Extremes are deployed when the ordinary statement feels insufficient to suppress what the extreme is being used to cover. The person who protests most forcefully that they do not care about what others think is the person who is most engaged in the management of what others think. The exaggeration is the volume. And the question worth asking is what is loud enough that it requires this much volume to drown out. The 11th truth addresses the psychology of the need for control. The more intense the need to manage external conditions, the more disorganized the internal state. This is not a judgment, it is a mechanical description. The external world is the one domain where the disordered self can impose structure that feels temporarily stabilizing. When someone needs to control outcomes, people, environments, and schedules with an intensity that exceeds what the situation requires, they are almost always doing so because the inner world, the emotional landscape, the self-concept, the unresolved material, feels like it is moving unpredictably. The control of what is outside is an attempt to feel what is not available inside. Seeing this clearly removes the threat the controlling person seems to present. They are not powerful. They are compensating. The 12th truth is one that has become increasingly visible in the current cultural moment. Relentless self-performance signals an absent inner life. Nietzsche would have recognized immediately what social media has made universally visible: the endless presentation of the self to the external gaze, the constant need to be witnessed, documented, and responded to. He would not have seen this as vanity in the simple sense. He would have seen it as the symptom of a self that does not have access to itself when the audience is removed. The person who must be seen is the person who ceases to experience themselves clearly when they are not being seen. The performance is not confidence. It is the sound of someone who has misplaced themselves and is trying to locate their existence through the responses of others. When you see the performance, you are seeing the absence behind it. The 13th truth returns to the deepest level of human motivation. No one argues from logic. Everyone argues from the wound that the logic is defending. When someone holds a view with particular intensity, when they become agitated when it is questioned, when they recruit it into every available conversation, when the abandonment of it seems to carry a weight disproportionate to the intellectual stakes, you are in the presence of a belief that is doing more than describing the world. It is protecting an experience. Every deeply held conviction carries within it the shape of what the person needed to be true in order to survive something. Not all convictions, but the ones that generate this particular emotional heat. When you understand that someone's worldview is also a scar, the worldview stops being something to argue with and starts being something to understand. The 14th truth concerns character in its most legible form. How someone treats the person who cannot benefit them is the truest available data. This is where Nietzsche's understanding of power as something that can be held without requiring expression becomes most visible. The person who is genuinely secure does not need to establish their security through the management of others. They can witness vulnerability without contempt. They can encounter weakness without punishing it. They can observe someone who cannot fight back and choose not to fight them. This restraint, this capacity to do a thing and choose not to, is the actual signature of inner stability. Watch for what people do in moments where cruelty would cost them nothing. What you see in those moments is not who they perform themselves to be. It is who they are. The 15th truth addresses the psychology of the need to be seen. The hunger for constant visibility is almost always a response to early invisibility. The person who requires attention at a level that goes beyond any reasonable proportion, who becomes destabilized when attention is withdrawn, who performs continuously and at escalating volume, is almost always the person who learned early that their existence required performance to be validated. The child who was genuinely seen as themselves, whose presence was acknowledged independent of their achievements, their behavior, their usefulness, does not typically develop this hunger. The one who is not seen learns that being seen requires performance. And then the performance never stops, because the underlying hunger is never satisfied by performance. It can only be satisfied by actual contact. An actual contact requires removing the performance, which is the one thing the person cannot do, because the performance is the only strategy they were ever given. The 16th truth is the one that dissolves the most interpersonal conflict when it is genuinely understood. Most attacks are disguised admiration. Nietzsche understood envy with unusual precision. He understood that the specific things we attack in others with the greatest vehemence are almost always the specific things we most want and believe we cannot have. The criticism is not neutral. It is shaped by the desire underneath it. The person who mocks someone's freedom is usually in private longing for it. The one who tears down someone's confidence is usually the one who has not been able to construct their own. Envy does not announce itself as envy. It announces itself as criticism, as skepticism, as moral concern about the object of the envy. But the energy under the announcement is unmistakably the energy of want. When you can see that what is aimed at you is shaped like envy, rather than like genuine criticism, it stops having authority over you. It becomes information about the person delivering it, rather than a verdict about you. The 17th truth is the one that explains more of the behavior you have found most confusing in the people around you. Adult behavior is rarely the product of adult decision-making. It is the repetition of childhood strategy. The roles people were forced into early, the peacemaker, the achiever, the invisible one, the responsible one, do not stay in childhood. They migrate into adult life because they were the scripts the person learned in the only environment that existed when they were learning. The person who could never receive help comfortably learned that needing help was not safe. The person who cannot tolerate conflict learned that conflict had dangerous consequences. The person who over-explains and justifies constantly learned that their right to a position required continuous demonstration. None of this is a choice in the adult. It is a pattern so deeply established, it runs below the level of conscious decision. Understanding this removes the frustration you might feel at behavior that seems willfully difficult. It is not willful, it is scripted. And scripts can be rewritten, but only when they are first recognized as scripts. The 18th and final truth brings everything together. Every repeated behavioral pattern is a confession. Learn to read confession, and you will never be surprised by a person again. The person who leaves every relationship at the same point in its development, just as real intimacy becomes available, is confessing something about what intimacy taught them. The person who overworks to the point of collapse and then resents the work they chose is confessing something about their relationship with rest and worth. The person who is warm in the initial stages of every connection and then withdraws as the connection deepens is confessing something about what closeness has historically cost them. None of these patterns are random. All of them have a source, and all of them, observed carefully over enough time, tell you the essential story of the person you are watching. Nietzsche's deepest ambition was not to arm people with cynicism. It was to produce in people a quality of seeing that made superficial judgment impossible. When you see the mask and understand what it is protecting, judgment dissolves. When you see the pattern and understand what wound it is managing, contempt dissolves. When you see the attack and understand the envy that shaped it, the injury dissolves. You are left with something much more useful than a verdict about the other person. You are left with understanding. And understanding, applied consistently, makes you genuinely unshakable. Not because nothing can touch you, but because you can see what is actually being thrown before it arrives, and you can respond to it from that clarity. The final question these 18 truths leave you with is not about others, it is about yourself. Every pattern you have recognized in someone else tonight, where did you recognize it from? Every wound you identified as driving someone else's behavior, which of those wounds do you carry? Every mask you learned to see clearly, what does yours look like, and what is it protecting? Because that is what Nietzsche was pointing at beneath all of it. The capacity to see clearly begins with the willingness to be seen clearly, by yourself before anyone else. That willingness, sustained, is the beginning of the kind of freedom that has nothing to prove to anyone.